Greetings, friends of liberty. Now surely one of the brightest stars in the entire firmament of British political economy has been the star of a man who died only 3 years ago in 1790, our dear Adam Smith, the author of that pioneering treatise, The Wealth of Nations. In this, Smith discusses all the many ways that economic freedom, of trade, of industry and its specialization, and of the use of machinery, can help make a nation more productive. But Smith left something important out of the wealth of nations. Shall I tell you what it is? Shall I tell you precisely why freedom works so well? Because free people utilize more knowledge than unfree people, and thus cannot help but be more productive. The knowledge is the key, and this Smith perhaps implied, but did not say. Now let us ask, what did Smith say about education and schooling? Here and in other places, does he believe that education should be supplied by the state, or instead by privately owned schools and teachers? Shall we not briefly survey his opinions on the matter? Well, in The Wealth of Nations, Smith said that if the teacher is prohibited from receiving any fee from his pupils, and his salary constitutes the whole of the revenue which he derives from his teaching, then his interest is set directly in opposition to his duty. What he means is that if a teacher is paid a salary, irrespective of how good his teaching is, then he will be more likely to neglect his teaching. Now, I would agree that if the teacher is paid solely from the fees of his students, he will be very motivated to teach well indeed, but this does not mean that if he receives a salary, he must of necessity do a bad job, since the school which employs him can, conceivably, monitor his teaching to ensure that it remains excellent. And Smith seems in part to agree with this, saying, if the authority to which the teacher is subject resides in some other extraneous persons, in the bishop of the diocese, or perhaps in some minister of state, it is not very likely that he will be suffered to neglect his duty altogether. So he agrees in part, but still has not much expectation from salaried teachers. Number 2, now Smith appears to have believed that the Scottish system of primary education was so effective because A, the state paid for constructing the schoolhouse, but B, the parents paid the teacher for the teaching. So a recommendation by Smith here for partly public, partly private funding. I would add, however, that in many cases, if teachers have small classes, then they can use their homes for teaching. This occurs with many school mistresses. Number 3, Smith, like his counterpart Robert Turgot in The French Economist and Statesman, also pointed out that when benefactors left large sums of money to schools in their wills as an endowment and stipulated what the funds should be used for, this in many cases didn't turn out well at all, since there was often little inspection by the authorities as to whether the school wasn't just taking the money and doing whatever it pleased. Even when the school followed the instructions of the benefactors, his desires might be very outdated and impractical, such as in the mandatory teaching of Latin and Greek, useless for many boys, and there was no incentive to increase the number of pupils taught, since the teacher's salary remained the same regardless. Now if we turn to the question of the various factors affecting the quality of education in your own 21st century in the entirety of the United Kingdom today, we find under review the great university con, how we broke our universities and betrayed a generation. Author David Craig, who's written, among others, Squandered, How Gordon Brown is Wasting Over £1 trillion of Our Money, and Hugh Openshaw, describe in detail the way that British higher education, just like American, has been severely damaged by the huge governmental attempt to subsidize virtually everyone to attend college. Craig and Openshaw begin by pointing out how radically British higher education has changed. 30 years ago, around 770,000 people, just 1 in 6 school leavers, people who finished high school, attended a university or polytechnic. Now there are over 2.3 million, almost half of all school leavers. And what was the fundamental idea that motivated subsidizing this massive influx? The belief that the more people go to uni, the better off we'll all be. Students will have a fun time, learn all sorts of useful things, and then get good jobs. Our economy will be more internationally competitive. Society will benefit as these graduates pay more taxes, and being educated and responsible citizens will be less of a burden on the NHS and social services. In other words, the belief that more of a good thing is always better. So if you have 1 slice of cream cheese for dessert, 10 must be better. Or if you're happily married to 1 woman, surely you should go to Saudi Arabia and marry 9 20-year-old belly dancers. Or if you have 1 whiskey sour, 9, without any question, will put you on cloud 9. But the reality, as most of us most of the time recognize, is that supply and demand must come into a natural equilibrium, a natural balance. Only then can individual or societal happiness be achieved. And so our authors ask, has the huge growth in the number of people going to uni, the great university expansion, really been the success the politicians and universities would have us believe? Their whole book shows why not. Firstly, since the supply of graduates has been artificially enlarged, the money coming from taxes and not the private sector, there simply aren't that many jobs available once students graduate. Because industrial, commercial, financial, scientific, and business institutions themselves have not enlarged. So who's going to hire this huge stream of extra graduates? As the Confederation of British Industry found, there are currently 10.1 million graduates in the UK, but only 9 million graduate-level jobs. Which degree holders are the ones that end up working as baristas the most? Fine arts, 29% of the time. Media studies, 26%. Performing arts, 23%. Design, 23%. And sociology, 22%. The most readily available jobs in the economy are retail, sales staff, food preparation, customer service reps, laborers and freight, stock and material movers, lorry and van drivers, and various healthcare aides. All of these require little, if any, university training. And so, given the oversupply of graduates being produced, it's not surprising that 11.5% of babysitters, 16% of all call center staff, and 1 in 4 theme park attendants are graduates. Secondly, since demand for education has been artificially increased by government, colleges invariably raise their tuition, meaning many more of those kids will now have to pay much higher tuition and go into even greater debt than before. One survey found that the average UK student debt in 2010 was over £19,000 and in 2015 was approaching £60,000. And about 18% don't even graduate, so what chance do they have of paying off their debts? Thirdly, since colleges are so focused on revenue now more than anything else, the number of international students whose tuition is higher has expanded from 52,000 in 1980 to over 400,000 today. B, increasing numbers of academic staff do little actual teaching. Instead, they are employed to generate more research funding. C, this desire for funding also means that students receive less time with teachers. So, for example, in 2012, students at Manchester University in social science had half as much contact time as Manchester students 20 years earlier. D, and the quality of teaching thus suffers. One student said, the academics were not really teachers. They didn't have communication skills. They weren't there to teach us. They talked to us like we were fellow professionals who understand everything. E, as a result, the workload of the average student, too, is decreased. Students typically receive an average of about 14 hours tuition a week and spend 12 hours in private study. This 26-hour workload compares unfavorably with European figures of 41 hours in Portugal, 35 in France, 34 in Germany. Fourthly, because so many more students are entering college, the quality of the average student entering is declining. So, for example, now 51% were enrolled with qualifications equivalent to below 3 grade Ds at A level. And not surprisingly, with many universities desperate for cash, the number of unconditional offers made to A-level 6 formers shot up from just 2,985 in 2013-14 to a massive 51,615 in 2015-16. Bodies, no matter how good the attached brains, is what unis want. This means, A, curriculum shrinkage sees universities teach less material on their degrees despite increases in student fees. This is because the students are dumber and B, less motivated, so can't get through as much material as before. A typical example would be French students studying French literature but in English translation and then writing about it in English. Not surprisingly, between 2003 and 2008, the proportion of all students in the UK on language degrees dropped from 3.3% to 2.9%. All this misleads employers who think they're getting someone who can actually speak and write in French. And not only can't French students speak and write French, but English literacy and numeracy has declined as well. Only 6% of employers believe that these skills have improved, whilst 42% and 35% respectively feel that literacy and numeracy have worsened amongst graduates. B, not surprisingly, easy majors like sports science, photography, and fine arts are popular. So, for example, between 2002 and 2012, universities more than doubled the number of sports science undergraduates from 15,000 to 34,000 and tripled the number of photography students from 5,000 in 2001 to 18,000 in 2012. But how many wedding photographers does a country really need? C, the kids who really want to deeply understand a subject realize eventually that classes aren't designed for them, but for the many mediocre students who, not really wanting to be there, just want to slide by. The kids with high aspirations are punished. D, grade inflation has increased during this period, likely caused by the expansion. This again disadvantages the best students because since so many more students get A's and B's, you can't tell the best from the rest. So, for example, in 1980, gaining 3 A's at A level would have meant that a student was exceptional. Today, this is no longer the case. In addition, universities are so keen on getting their students to pass that they sometimes will change the grades retrospectively. Sometimes regrading can occur without the consent of the academic who provided the original marks. Astonishing. Administrators will sometimes even send out notices saying, I would urge all academic staff to look very carefully at those students gaining marks in the 30s. If the mark is 38, 39, then please, where possible, look for the extra 1 to 2 marks if appropriate. E, this lowering of quality appears with international students as well, since the university charges them more and thus has even less desire for high standards. So one student said that, as a result, the varying abilities of the international students and their poor English meant that I had the impression at times that things had to be pitched at the lowest common denominator. F, plagiarism, too, is increased, with 78% of academics admitting student plagiarism an increasing problem in their institution, this ranging from bringing crib sheets or mobile phones into exams to paying private firms to write essays. One survey at Cambridge found that 50% of students admitted to plagiarizing, often straight from Wikipedia. Of course, one way they avoid getting caught plagiarizing is just to pay one of the many companies to write their essays for them. One student spent £17,000 on this. In many cases, the teachers actually cooperate with cheating. There has been a growing trend towards open book exams in universities. Students can take in books and whatever other material they wish. In one case of a live exam, I kid you not, students could access the answers during the assessment and copy them into the document that they submitted for grading. Fifthly, college, not surprisingly, are expert at marketing themselves and thus, A, don't often advertise how many graduates actually end up working in their chosen degree field instead of just being employed as baristas, with one study finding 47% working in non-related fields after 12 years, and another finding that 142 graduates were applying for each investment banking post. B, colleges often don't advertise how much additional postgraduate study is needed to become employed as a working professional, like a psychologist. C, they don't often advertise how only graduates coming from the most competitive unis will often have a chance for employment. Sixthly, other miscellaneous societal negative side effects of the expansion include A, the mediocre or worst universities expanding the most. But good universities, have they expanded? The UK's two strongest universities, Oxford and Cambridge, have hardly increased their domestic undergraduate student body at all during expansion, less than 1%. B, many female students have been incentivized to study nursing, but not nursing as a vocation achieved in 18 months, which used to happen, but instead nursing as a degree program, which takes 3 years. And what happens when all those prospective nurses who want to care for patients are instead forced to study relatively useless subjects? An immediate drop of 23% in the number of people applying to study nursing. Thus, as of 2025, a shortage of 10,000 nurses in the NHS system, with the consequence of many unnecessary deaths, likely numbering in the many thousands, the most notable being from bacterial infections like MRSA and C. diff. Amanda Steen, in her book Who Cares?, which I reviewed here, described in detail the present sorry state of UK hospital nursing. C. The undercapitalization of higher education. More than 90% of higher education institutions had at least 10% of their buildings judged below the sound and operationally safe category. And despite the skyrocketing tuition prices, over 20% of all UK universities are now at some risk of bankruptcy. D. Paperwork. With government comes bureaucracy, and with bureaucracy, paperwork. Because universities now are so controlled and regulated by government, the amount of paperwork everyone has to fill out is huge. So not only as a result is education and healthcare too made more expensive thereby, but also the frontline workers in those sectors, like teachers, doctors, and nurses, hate their jobs more since they waste their time filling out useless forms. Everyone loses. E. The expansion, too, has resulted in a glut of professors being produced, meaning that the average pay for many academics has dropped comparatively. This has occurred in America as well. Finally, if we turn to the author's solutions to the many problems caused by this governmentally induced artificial expansion, what do they advocate? A. First, thankfully, they understand that government is the problem, saying, Nothing is ever so bad that government can't make it worse. Aircraft carriers with no aircraft, spy planes that couldn't spy, the Millennium Dome, which lay empty for years, supposedly smart motorways that are anything but smart. But these many billions are just small change compared to the massive bill taxpayers could be landed with due to the student loans fiasco. The reality, as they describe, is that the vast majority of student debt will likely never be repaid. After 30 years, all debt being forgiven anyway. Not surprisingly, the strategy of many student debtors is either to leave the country or pay the debt off slowly and then after 30 years, have the remainder forgiven. Secondly, the authors point out that the great uni expansion is a type of bubble, and like all bubbles must burst or at least deflate to a degree at some point, which now appears to be starting. Partly this is purely for demographic reasons, since the generations after the baby boomers are having fewer kids, and partly because the value-to-price ratio of having a degree is radically declining. Thirdly, the authors appear to advocate simply gradually reducing the number of students by 5% a year for at least the next 5 years by setting a minimum grade to access loans and restricting the funding for various vocational courses like law, psychology, and social work to reduce oversupply. They also advocate fiddling and diddling with other regulations and requirements. But the best answer is much simpler. Since all public education is a net loss from what a purely private sector would offer, simply privatize everything. Get the government completely out of education at every level. Before World War II, and certainly in the 19th century, the great uni expansion would never have happened because higher education was private and the private sector would never have done anything so incredibly stupid. Happy for my part that here in the age of revolution, the ideas of Adam Smith reign supreme, and that for the most part he understood the value of educational freedom. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.